You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at voting rights for prisoners. It's been a long-running row between a European Rights Court and our elected parliamentarians in Westminster. The European Court of Human Rights previously banned member states from blanket rules that stop prisoners from voting. Now, the Euro judges say the UK and other governments can have wide discretion in how they implement that ban. The government has 6 months to outline its proposed reforms. It's another case that has left many in Britain wondering why they handed over sovereignty to foreign judges in Strasbourg. And it raises questions about our reasons for putting crooks behind bars in the first place. So, should prisoners be allowed to vote, or are their rights nixed by their crimes? Has the European Court drawn a line in the sand, or is its judgment open to interpretation? And is prison about punishment or rehabilitation? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studios. I'm joined by Dr. Abhijit Pandya from a think tank called the Centre for Democratic Studies, Juliet Lyon, Director of the Prison Reform Trust, Michael Greaves, over the line from Brussels, the party secretary of the UK Independence Party, and John Hirst, a convicted killer turned rights campaigner. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following question. Maybe first of all to you, Dr. Pandya. Should all convicts in British jails be allowed to vote?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, that was a quick one. Juliet?
Yes, they should. They're people. They'd lose their liberty. They don't have to lose their identity and other rights and responsibilities.
And Michael?
No, and that is the clear democratic will both of Parliament and the people of the United Kingdom.
Okay, and finally, John?
Of course, all human beings should have the human right to vote. It's under the convention and the UK signed up to it, so we have to abide by it.
Okay, thank you for all your comments there. We're going to get on to that issue again, but first of all, I wanted to take a quick look at the ruling that came from the court in Strasbourg this week. If you have a look through the British press and the media and how they've covered it, it seems that there's a degree of the ruling which is open to interpretation. Take the headline which was on the BBC site, which said UK can decide which prisoners vote, says European Court. Turn to another publication such as the Daily Mail and you see that European judges rode roughshod over British sovereignty yesterday by ruling that prisoners must be allowed to vote. Maybe I'll go first of all to you, Dr. Pandya. What do you make of the ruling?
My view is that the court has completely flouted its jurisdiction in even entertaining this issue. If you look at the convention itself, nowhere in the convention does it say that the court has a right to determine whether or not people should be allowed democratic entitlement. It's clear from the drafting of the convention that the idea of crime and security is a matter of national discretion for contracting parties, for states. It is not a matter for courts.
Okay, Juliet, that was Dr. Pandya's view on whether or not the court has the right to make the decision that it's made. But I suppose my question was more geared towards, what does the ruling actually state?
Well, this ruling upholds the original ruling that was made in John Hirst's case, and I know you're going to be talking to John in a minute. But essentially, that case showed that there'd been a violation of Article 3, Protocol 1 of the Human Rights Act. What it did do was allow what it called a margin of appreciation to the government to determine exactly how it would apply the judgment. But what it was very clear about was that the blanket ban on prisoners voting was unlawful. And that's been maintained in this particular case in Italy yesterday, that the blanket ban is unlawful and it requires governments, member states, to comply. We're very quick to say other member states should comply with other things that, we can't pick and choose what laws we obey. We're all part of a convention to which we're signed up.
And Michael Greaves, turning to you in Brussels then, what's your opinion on what the ruling actually states? Do you agree with what's been said there?
It's plainly the case that they have upheld and indeed felt that the Hirst case was actually somewhat conservatively decided in their opinion, and that the consequence of all that is that the United Kingdom is going to have to let some prisoners vote, and legislation will have to be introduced to permit that. But there's one very striking thing about the judgment, which is that there is a complete absence of any consideration of the victims. Every crime, every criminal deprives the victim of their rights. There seems to be very little consideration in this judgment of that. And that, I think, is a striking feature of this kind of legislation and this kind of law.
And John, maybe you can give us opinion on this, but also perhaps explain to our listeners why it is being referred to as your case, as the John Hirst case.
Well, because I'm the one who took the application against the United Kingdom, that is Parliament, the judiciary and the executive, the three arms of the state, and they was found guilty in the European Court of Human Rights. Now, we have a Human Rights Act, and it states that if anyone's human rights have been abused by a public authority, then that person is a victim. And indeed, in my case, the European Court pointed out that I'm a victim because my human rights was abused by denying me the vote. By the same token, all the other prisoners who have been denied their human right to vote by the UK's failure to abide by the decision are victims. So all this nonsense about victims, the actual victims here are the people being abused by the United Kingdom. I mean, they have a go at Russia, they have a go at Italy and other countries for bad human rights records. But the UK's human rights record is quite bad in itself. And Russia has actually leapt forward with the European Court and the Convention, and they've put in great reforms in Russia. So the UK could get some examples actually from Russia.
And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your case, because the case that was brought by you stems from the fact that you were incarcerated yourself. Can you give a bit of background to your conviction and how your opinion was formed by your experiences inside?
Well, it was reading a book where it stated that there was no votes in prison, and as a result of that, Parliament lacked the will for any penal reform. So obviously I thought, well, the idea to do is to ensure that prisoners do get the vote so that we can push forward for reforms. And that's what I did. But what we've had so far is the UK refused to accept that a lone man who learnt law in prison could actually tackle a corrupt system and beat it in a court of law, which is what I did. You know, I mean, it wasn't just me who did it. There was a murderer, Frodel, in Italy. He also got the human right to vote. And there was a rapist and a paedophile in Greens and MT, and they've also got the right to vote. So when they start trying to say which prisoners can and can't have the vote, we've got a murderer, manslaughter, a rapist and a paedophile, all won the human right to vote. So who's left to take the vote off? You know, the cat burglar, you know, the TV licence dodger. You know, it doesn't leave much, does it?
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at voting rights for prisoners. I'm joined by Dr. Abhijit Pandya from a think tank called the Centre for Democratic Studies, Juliet Lyon, Director of the Prison Reform Trust, Michael Greaves, over the line from Brussels, Party Secretary of the UK Independence Party, and John Hirst, a convicted killer turned rights campaigner. Maybe I'll turn back to you, Dr. Abhijit, and I'd like to get comment on you from what John was just saying there. He was talking about a number of cases of prisoners that have been given the right to vote, guilty of all kinds of crimes. Essentially, what is your moral argument on this? Should prisoners have the right to vote, and why or why not?
Well, I'll put it absolutely bluntly and clearly. If you follow the presumption behind allowing them to vote, you go down the line of being able to then justify prisoners standing up for election and that sort of thing. Because the whole point of being in prison is that it's punishment. It's punishment. You haven't abided by the rules of society, and therefore you're booted out of the normal social game of society. You're excluded because you have basically shown contempt for the normal laws and practices of normal law-abiding individuals. Now, when you think about the fact that you couldn't then, on the same basis, preclude someone who's in prison, for example, a rapist, standing up for election, you realise the kind of absurdity and what an absolute nonsense of the rule of law such a ruling would actually do. It would basically totally undermine the entire point of having a criminal justice system, which is to be a deterrent, primarily, by saying, look, if you don't behave by the rules everyone else does, you are put outside the playing field of society, and it would encourage criminals to say, well, there's no difference between being in prison and out of prison. Currently, comfort levels in prisons, in some prisons are ridiculous. So that boundary is then completely diminished. The whole point of deterrence is lost. And the other point is that you have not provided an effective punishment or retribution by society itself for saying this is wrong, we don't accept your conduct. And that is the moral basis for it. And if you carry on down this road, there's no reason, once you undermine those two basic presumptions as to why you lock people away or have a criminal justice system in the first place, what you do is you lead to all sorts of absurdities, like prisoners saying, well, I have the vote now, I should be able to stand up for election. And that just totally makes a complete farce of the criminal justice system. So on a matter of principle alone, this just simply cannot be entertained. And for a foreign court, which has no basis in the treaty itself to do this, it's really much more a sign of states and governments not getting the court under control than the court itself, I think, is the real problem here. You know, these rights within the European Convention for Human Rights should never have been taken to a level where an outside adjudicator could actually determine national domestic legislative function on them.
OK, perhaps we'll come to the court issue later, but on the ethics and the moral issue, Juliet, it's a strong argument put forward by Dr. Pandya, and of course very easily comprehensible to the man on the street, that giving prisoners the right to vote will undermine our criminal justice system.
Well, it's bizarre, actually, because when you talk to prison governors, the Prison Governors Association itself have supported the move for prisoners to vote. They don't see it as a top priority. They see it as an ordinary part of rehabilitation and resettlement, as do chief inspectors, past and present, as do senior officials who aren't able to speak because of the Civil Service Code, as do bishops to prisons. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, I suspect, but I could be wrong, that Dr. Pandya perhaps doesn't know much about what happens within prison walls. And the people who do run prisons and want them to work, want them to be decent, want them to be productive places, and want people to leave prison less likely to offend than when they went in, see voting as a normal part of resettlement. They don't see it as a big deal, but they do see it as an important part of the work they're doing. The punishment, and that's where I would agree with Dr. Pandya, the punishment is loss of liberty, and prison is undoubtedly a punishment. And I don't think any of us should ever underestimate the impact of that complete loss of liberty which that punishment involves. And that's why it's very important that only our most serious and our most violent offenders are put behind bars. But they have to go behind bars. So let's make sure that during that period of time they have the opportunity to reorientate their lives, to work closely with staff, to reconstruct their lives, and so that they can lead a law-abiding life on release. It is extraordinary to see politicians queuing up to say we don't want people in prison to act responsibly. Of course we do. It's very important.
Michael Greaves, I'll turn to you at that stage. Maybe your comments on the moral argument. The position that was just put forward by Juliet is that giving prisoners the right to vote, or allowing them to vote, could be an important part of their rehabilitation, allowing them to reorient themselves as citizens of this country.
It's plainly right that prisoners should be rehabilitated, but this is, I think, a step too far. Here you have, and I refer to Abhijit Pandya's observations about what this involves. It involves, effectively, prisoners who have committed serious crimes having a say on who should be elected and who should be in Parliament speaking on issues such as penal policy, sentencing policy, and criminal law policy. I happen to think that it is wrong that somebody who is in prison should have that right. And I think Juliet Lyon speaks of all the great and good who are in favour of giving prisoners the vote. Unfortunately, I think the British public do not agree with her by a very large majority. We live in a democracy, and perhaps she should remember that.
Michael, what percentage of the British public do you think are on your side on this one?
I suspect well over 80% of the British public is not very keen on giving prisoners the vote. But perhaps she should stand for Parliament and on a votes for prisoners ticket, and we shall see.
Maybe I'll turn to you now, John. You've got a perspective from the other side of this, having served time in jail yourself. What difference do you think it would have made inside the jail in which you served your time if prisoners there were allowed to vote?
You didn't let me cover the moral issue. At the European Court of Human Rights, the UK argued that by committing their offences, prisoners had lost the moral authority to vote. They lost that argument at the court, and one of the reasons why they lost that argument at the court was it's never been a qualification to get the franchises in this country to have moral authority. And the former Archbishop of Canterbury, when the expenses scandal hit the headlines in this country, stated that Parliament had lost the moral authority to govern. So, this moral argument can go both ways. It's not just crooked MPs who can put up the moral arguments, but the reality is that Labour conducted public consultation exercises, and the majority, 47%, actually supported all prisoners having the vote, and only 4 people, not 4%, 4 people supported the Labour government's position of 4 years and under getting the vote, or 12 months and under getting the vote.
You complained that you weren't going to be able to put forward your moral argument, but what is your moral argument?
That the UK argued that prisoners had lost the moral authority to vote by committing their offences and being imprisoned. They lost that argument in the court because it has never been a qualification to get the vote to have moral authority. If you did, then MPs wouldn't be getting into the House because of their expenses fiddling going on. I mean, where's the moral authority to fiddle their expenses, taxpayers' expenses? There isn't any. What you got is a load of hypocrites in the Houses of Parliament and MEPs.
Dr. Pandya, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, there's quite a few things there which I'd like to address. I'd go backwards. I start with the point made about the prison service, and we want prisoners to be rehabilitated. I think one of the problems that's happened, if you look at the rates of reoffending, is that prisons have become, because of rehabilitation, too comfortable a place. What we're losing sight of is the fundamental aims of what imprisonment should be, and any sentence passed in the criminal justice system should be. Breaking the law, making a criminal offence is a very, very serious thing. All these debates seem to undermine that. They seem to underplay that as to how serious it is to break the law. This is something that's becoming watered down. And the fact that politicians are breaching supposed rules on expenses is not a case to actually give prisoners the votes. Those two things are totally mutually exclusive. There may be a case for criminalising certain conducts of politicians, but that is part and parcel of taking the law seriously. And the law is not going to be taken seriously by saying, politicians are doing this with their expenses, and therefore let's give prisoners the vote. In fact, the opposite is going to happen. The law's going to be taken less seriously. So we take a step back and realise just how serious it is to break the law. And this is something that's been undermined by continuous comforting in the prisons, too much pandering to prisoners who have TVs in their rooms. We've seen the stories of prisoners who are allowed to bring things in like, trainers and video games into their prisons. And this doesn't help. I mean, it may help certain prison staff who may be struggling to keep people under control, but it doesn't in fact help telling that person that what they've done is very, very seriously wrong, and that is much more likely to stop someone reoffending than people being told, here's another right you can have on top of having all these comforts. You can also have the right to vote. Well, for some people who see prison as a better way to live because they come from awful backgrounds, and they see, well, actually, it's no really that different in prison. In fact, it might be better for me because I can get the right to vote. I may even be able to stand for election once that right's been passed. I live in reasonable comfort. Well, in fact, they'll probably think, well, it's actually okay to break the law. And that's what we've got to fundamentally deal with here. It's the fact that breaking the law is very, very wrong. And anybody who does that should be treated in a severe and harsh manner. And that's what we've become afraid of doing in this country. We need to talk more about the harsher things we should be doing to prisoners rather than the things we should be doing to soften things up, so we can protect the public and show that there is a dividing line between abiding by the law and not abiding by the law.
Juliet, how do you respond to that? Prisons are getting too soft, and giving prisoners the vote would just be one more step in the wrong direction.
I'd really like to ask Dr. Pandya for the evidence he has that prisons are too comfortable. I mean, is that something you do regularly, Dr. Pandya? You visit prisons, you know the prison service, you understand what they're doing, and you're talking to governors and staff and people in prison and their families. Is that right?
Well, the first thing is I have been to many prisons during my time as a law student and as a time when I was studying criminal law and criminology. But I don't think that's the issue here. The issue isn't here of how comfortable, how harsh they are. I'm saying they're not harsh enough. Whatever levels of comfort that the prison service may think, the point is that the vast majority of the public who are law-abiding want people who break those rules to be treated as harsh as possible.
And the reason I asked you that question, and I think you've answered it more than adequately, is that it's very important that people know what's happening now in the prison system, not when they were students, but now, understand what the prison service is striving to achieve, understand the difference between toughness and effectiveness, and don't peddle really malicious ideas that prisons are a kind of holiday camp, because they're not. And I spend a considerable amount of time in prison. I used to work for the prison service. I respect what the staff there are trying to achieve. They are not holiday camps, nor should they be. They need to be places of absolute last resort. They need to be effective for us to have a safer society. And it's really important that we don't go around, I think, particularly when we don't know, saying, they are, just like a holiday camp, and the vote would be just one more comfort. It's not that comfortable, I think, if you take voting seriously, because it's a matter of choice, and it's a matter of giving proper thought to who you're going to vote for. The reason that former Home Secretary Douglas Hirst, who's our president, believes that prisoners should vote is that he thinks it's important for people to act in a civilised manner, even if they're behind bars, and he thinks it's important for MPs to engage with people in prison, that includes staff and prisoners, because it's important to drive forward the kind of conditions and treatment that lead to an effective, a decent and a humane prison system of which we can all be proud.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at voting rights for prisoners. I'm joined by Dr. Abhijit Pandya from a think tank called the Centre for Democratic Studies, Juliet Lyon, Director of the Prison Reform Trust, Michael Greaves, over the line from Brussels, Party Secretary of the UK Independence Party, and John Hirst, a convicted killer turned rights campaigner. Maybe I'll turn to you at that stage, Michael, because I'd like to get your opinion on what I think is an issue that's very close to your heart and the heart of your party, and this is whether or not a European court, a court in Strasbourg, should have powers that exceed those of our elected representatives here in Westminster. There is this long-running case of prisoners and whether or not they should have the right to vote. There's a clash. Another one has been the prominent case of the radical cleric Abu Qatada. British officials want him deported to Jordan to face bomb plot charges. His legal recourse, of course, has been to the European Rights Court. He argues that he faces torture and an unfair trial if extradited. What does your party say about this issue?
We have reluctantly come to the conclusion that our adherence to the European Convention of Human Rights has passed its sell-by date, and that much of what is happening and emerging from Strasbourg judgments has simply lost the plot. You have situations whereby the rights of convicted killers, convicted terrorists, are placed above those of their victims, and the balance of these matters has simply gone totally askew. And so, with great reluctance, and in its early days, the European Court of Human Rights did good work, and the Convention was a proper response to the evils of the Second World War. But we've moved a long way from that, and the situation now is that, and I go back to the issue of victims, the rights of victims are simply being trampled upon by some of the judgments which are being issued from Strasbourg. And I thought that Mr. Hirst actually eloquently made the case against prisoners having the vote by what he said. I mean, his contempt for victims was perfectly obvious from what he said. Let us just remind everybody out there who Mr. Hirst really is, because I noticed he didn't want to talk about his conviction. He was in prison because he killed a lady with an axe, took an axe to her 7 times, and he was given a discretionary life sentence. This was after a career of crime which involved burglary, robbery, arson, violence, and dishonesty. And whilst in prison, he attacked a prison officer. It is this man who seeks to have the vote. It is this man that the Prison Reform Trust would have the right to vote from prison. I think most right-thinking people would think that that was an outrage.
John, I'm going to let you get in there because it's a big question. You took away...
contempt for victims. What I pointed out and what that UKIP right-wing extremist fails to appreciate is that under the Human Rights Act, anyone whose human rights are abused by the state is a victim. And in my judgment, it quite clearly states that the European Court accepted that I am a victim. So for him to say that I show contempt for victims is ridiculous. The one showing contempt for victims is the likes of David Cameron, who are refusing to implement this decision. They've been found guilty of violating human rights, and it's this country and people like this UKIP bloke on £200,000 a year expenses who is abusing victims' rights.
Fair enough, John, but it's a big question and you haven't answered it. In 1979, you took away not only the right of this woman to vote, but to do anything, to have a normal life, simply to live. Why should the state not take away your rights after you committed such an atrocious crime?
They did do for 25 years, and I paid 10 years over the top because I made legal challenges. Now, they don't tell you about that, do they?
How do you feel about your victim now?
Me attacking a prison officer. In fact, the prison officer attacked me and I defended myself and I beat him. But as a result of it, I served 3 months down the block.
How do you feel?
Again, he's wrong.
How do you feel about the crime you committed?
How do I under if I paid the time for the crime I've committed?
Do you feel remorse? Do you feel remorse?
Well, 2 Court of Appeal decisions said I felt remorse by handing myself into the police station. If someone commits a crime and then goes and hands himself into the police station, it's a strong indication of remorse. And, I stand by those 2 Court of Appeal decisions.
And on Michael's other point, he says that the European Court of Human Rights has lost the plot. You've obviously worked through the court system for a number of years now. Do you think it's a viable institution making correct decisions?
Yes, right up until Scopula. I mean, what you had there was the court was being threatened by dictatorship, the Cameron dictatorship. And they did sort of waver a bit. And what you've got, actually, one legal commentator has said that in the Scopula case, they have actually reached a political decision and they've fudged it, and I would agree with that. And I think that the European Court of Human Rights should not appease the UK one iota on that. I mean, when you start appeasing a human rights abuser and a bully, they just carry on doing that, human rights abusing and bully, and they're doing it in the papers. You pointed out all these newspapers doing this. I mean, there's too much collusion between our right-wing media here, which isn't really a free press, and the politicians and the corrupt police. I mean, there's a Leveson inquiry going on at the moment into this issue. You know, it's a pity that they don't sort of address this in the Leveson inquiry as well, because what these newspapers have been writing about myself and prisoners' votes cases is just utterly disgusting and attacking the court. I mean, you've got someone there saying these foreign judges. You know, all of those judges are foreign to everyone else in there. That is the whole point about it. One judge from each country. So the other 46 are all foreign. So what we're hearing is a lot of xenophobic and racist nonsense from people like UKIP.
Maybe I'll just turn back to my guest in the studio here. We're running out of time. Maybe Dr. Pandya, first of all, to you. What do you think is going to happen next with what is likely to become a political issue here in Whitehall? We understand there's cross-party support for fighting this decision by the European Court. How do you think it's going to play out?
Well, before I came in here, I saw David Cameron say in Prime Minister's Question Time that there's no way that the prisoners would be given the right to vote. So, and I assume that's the normal, sensible road to go down. I obviously don't have a crystal ball, but I would probably think that the government will fight this issue. It would be mad not to. I don't think the vast majority of public opinion, as Michael Greaves says, that would not want prisoners to have the vote. And I think that politicians have to be completely blind and deaf if they think otherwise. So I think it's just we will fight it, and God help us if prisoners do get the right to vote.
And Juliet, it seems like you're fighting a losing corner there.
Well, it's not about fighting a corner. It's an ordinary, as I said, thing to expect that people should want prisoners, people in prison, to act responsibly. It's not about, in this case, thinking about victims, except that if we want people to leave prison in a state where they're going to behave responsibly, there would be and should be fewer victims. And we'd all stand up for that. The tragedy of this is that this case has become hugely disproportionate. It's become a matter for Europe. It's become highly politicised. What would have been a normal, basic human right, a normal thing that you'd expect as part of resettlement and rehabilitation, has got completely blown out of all proportion. And it's disappointing because it's led to that situation where people are feeling that they've got to make a public stand. I think most people would reasonably expect people in prison to act responsibly and would want to see people leave jail far less likely to offend than when they went in. And if voting is seen by prison governors and others as a normal part of that, then so be it. It is now, anyway, the will of the court. It's made that clear for 8 years. It's constantly restated its position. It's our court. We're all signed up to it. And in the end, the matter will have to proceed. But it's very sad that we've ended up in an argument which is so counterproductive.
That was Juliet Lyon, director of the Prison Reform Trust, saying that the issue of voting rights for prisoners has sadly become a political football. I was also joined by Dr. Abhijit Pandya from a think tank called the Centre for Democratic Studies, Michael Greaves, over the line from Brussels, the party secretary of the UK Independence Party, and also by John Hirst, a convicted killer turned rights campaigner. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update of what's